Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much for being here, and thank you, Bishop, for being here and willing to engage with our questions. Our bishop will be entering her 6th year in the episcopacy this May. Wow. And she, like I, has a sabbatical coming later this year in October.
I have to show you all. It's funny because I actually have a countdown on my phone. So I open it up and it says 284 days.
Yeah, not that you're anxious to do that.
We're delighted to have you with us, and we thank you for being here.
And thank you for getting up at the crack of dawn.
And there was a lot more snow in Denver.
There was more snow on the streets of Denver than here. It was crazy.
We're in a little donut.
We're in the donut.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
thank you.
So we had 5 questions submitted ahead of time online. The bishop has had an opportunity to look at them, but of course, there's an opportunity to ask questions from here today as well. So the first question, or do you want to start with anything? Or
No, I'm glad you're all here.
this is a little correction on this question. We thought it was you.
No, it wasn't me.
It wasn't you. From the cathedral, a sermon from the cathedral, the speaker said, and we learned later it was Katie Pearson, that 70% of the people sitting in the pews were not raised in the Episcopal Church. And why do you believe they are coming to the Episcopal Church? And what do you think is important in how we welcome and integrate them into our church?
How was your Christmas this year?
Good.
Great.
One of the things I noticed I've talked to folks, a lot of folks were telling me that people who they'd never seen before were showing up for Christmas Eve. And I always say, I never disparage my holly lilies. Those are my Christmas and Easter folks. And I never disparage them because whatever is stirring in them to come at that hunger, I count to be God. I think we are entering a time that I personally think is a great time to be an Episcopalian, because we have come sort of through this place where largely folks are religiously nothing. You know, lots of folks would say they were spiritual or not religious, but the great thing about being spiritual and not religious is that from time to time that piece pushes you to seek a deepening of that spirituality. And I think as Episcopalians, we have this understanding that God does not have to be force fed. that we can encounter God in really holy ways. And I think in this time where Christianity is being bandied about in so many crazy, quite unchristian ways, I think folks are really searching for something. And a lot of those folks are coming from backgrounds where they have been wounded by church. As the Episcopal Church, we're good at that. We're not great, but we're really good at dealing with folks who have been wounded by church and offering a different understanding in terms of a God that calls us into relationship as a loving parent, not a God that wants to be a punitive judge on our lives. And so that's what I would say. People are really looking for meaning. And what really breaks my heart is that people who are looking for meaning and belonging don't believe that can be found in church. And I think they're curious. And so I feel like we have an opportunity to model something different about what it means to be a person of faith.
We understand you do not define church as a building. So what is your definition of church?
My definition of church is a community of people that have decided to be community in spite of their differences, that have found a way to welcome the Holy Spirit in their midst. It's a group of people who worship together, not in terms of sort of wanting to be entertained, but in terms of wanting to reorient themselves toward God. And a community that is committed to continually being transformed and helping to transform the world around in the name of Christ. That's what church is to me. And, I really feel like we do have obligations because of who we are. We have obligations to our past, both the positive and the negative, right? We have obligations to our past. And we also have work for our future that we're called to do together. And I think that is what makes this church.
When you say obligations to the past, what in particular are you thinking?
So in negative ways, sort of all the damage that has been done in the name of Jesus, right? We carry that with us. We have to reckon with that. And we do have obligations to right those wrongs. But we also have a heritage. I always say every community is composed of the people who are present, the people who have died and gone on, and the people who are coming. And so that we have that obligation towards looking toward the future as well.
It's nice to hear your definition since we don't have a building.
Yeah, that whole notion of what from the past we need to carry on and what needs to be let go. How do we move into the future? I think that's a very present issue for St. Paul's.
Yeah, I think it is for every church, actually. I mean, I think, I always say you don't have the burden of a building, but you do have the obligation to figure out. So what is your witness in this new way? How do you witness to your community? How are you present for the people around you in a way that's different? And I was just sitting here talking to Felicia about some different stuff that she's done. And I'm like, ooh, can I steal that? That would be helpful. And I think it's really helpful for any community, a worship community, to ask, what can we offer? What do we have to offer? Not just Fort Collins, but your region. Other congregations here. I mean, I think it's really powerful. I just have to say, it's a point of pride to me that I have so many women rectors in the Front Range region. It just makes me happy.
Us too.
Let's see, next on the list, what is your, okay, this is a longer question, so I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's really important. What's your opinion on the use of alternative resources for the congregations that want to move away from male God language toward more loving and inclusive liturgy? And here's why I asked this question. I'm deeply troubled by the growing voice of hate speech masquerading as Christianity, especially after this last election. In my opinion, masculine language for God, he, Lord, King, undergirds and bolsters misogynist attitudes and actions on the part of white supremacist, patriarchal Christian nationalists. These words are not benign and continue to turn a blind eye to the harm this language does to all humans is unconscionable. When we use this language in our liturgies uncritically, we make the Episcopal Church more comfortable for those who hold misogynist, patriarchal beliefs and less safe for women, non-binary people, and just about anyone who's not a straight white male.
So I'll start by telling you my theory on language. All language is metaphor. All language is an attempt to articulate a reality. And the more abstract and big that reality, the more language you need to talk about it. So I could tell you lots of metaphors for love, but I can't really explain to you what it felt like to hold my baby that I just given birth to in my arms and bring that child up to my face. I can't tell you adequately but I can use language to try to describe that for you. I think that the same is true about God. We need more language, not less language. We need more language about God. And that said, I am not willing to cede my language to people who abuse it. I'm not willing to do that. I believe that we have, the scripture gives us so many ways to talk about who God is. And a lot of that is masculine language, but as in the Gospel of John, when John is talking about God as Father, he's trying to evoke a relationship. And I always say, when you hear Father in John, think of the loving Father and the son that runs away and spends all his fortune, right? That John wants to convey a relationship of love, of parental love, of love that goes above and beyond what is expected. And I think if we take that out, we neuter literally John's metaphor in that. And so for me, I'm always about expanding our language. How do we take in more language? But I'm not willing to cede Christ the King, because I think the model of kingdomship that God holds for us is so far beyond sort of our earthly, warped, twisted, dominating metaphors of what dominion is, that we take dominion and make it domination. They're not the same thing. And so to that, I'm always open to how do we expand how we talk about God. I mean, people, look at me funny because whenever I say the creed, I always say, and became human, right? Because I think that humanity is more expansive than the male gender. And so that's the piece that I think is important for us, is to not cede our language to people who would abuse it. I've said, my entire ordained life, I am not giving up my Bible to people who would use it as a weapon. Not giving it up. Because I think it is not, it was never intended to be a tool of oppression.
So you're talking in what you just said about ways of opening up that language. But when we're just in a worship service with people who come off the street, as a for instance, they don't have that. So like for a Eucharistic prayer, for instance, how do you feel about using expansive language? And not exclusive, but expansive.
I mean, I think we're as a church, we worked on it a lot. I mean, enriching our worship has just been that. It's like, how do we expand our language for talking about God in the context of worship? And recognizing that our context as church has to be more than worship. It has to be beyond that, and how we invite people into learning more and to be willing to be shaped by that is important.
And I will say that at St. Paul's, I've heard a lot of desire for expansive language, different creeds, different Eucharistic prayers, and you, Bishop, have given us permission to use a lot of different ones. And I've heard wonderful feedback when we have used them here, when we rotate through. Now, for some of us like the language that we have. And, we knew the big controversy around changing the prayer book. So sometimes those versions can be challenging to some people, but we're of the mind that it helps us broaden the language, like you were saying. Gives us more expansive imagery. Thank you for allowing us. I think it's important.
I mean, and I think I always say, for me, the miracle of Pentecost is about Jesus followers learning the language of the people around. And I feel like it is incumbent upon us as church to find ways to speak to folks that they understand, and then to invite them into this expanded language that we have with them. I think that's
Bishop. What I like about trying different liturgies is I'm more alert. I'm just not saying something I wrote. I have to stop and pay attention to the words, the different words. And I think it helps me be more present during the service.
Since we're talking about language, and the number of times the Bible has been retranslated and retranslated and retranslated. And but one that I've had a number of discussions about, and I really don't, anyway, only Son. That's the one, that Jesus is the only Son of God. And that limits God to me. That we say, you can't do this again. You can't send another culture a Jesus that's not. So, what's your answer?
I think the language around incarnation is complicated, because incarnation is not something that we have experience of in our day-to-day life. And so all articulations around that are articulations about how unique this thing was. Can God do another unique thing? Absolutely. But our faith's tradition, our experience, our church's experience of that is unique. And how we talk about that, we try to make it as special as it is. And do we do that adequately? Probably not. But I think that's the intent and the articulation around that. And just to be honest, I think that the commands of Jesus are so much more urgent.
Yeah.
They're so much more urgent in terms of feeding the hungry, and clothing the naked, and protecting the downtrodden, and our responsibilities to the refugee and the stranger. I mean, they take up so much more of my consciousness. So
yes, I have a question about it. Kind of about language, a little bit of it different. Since the Bible has been translated so many times, as she said, and we know it was not written in English. The names Mary and Joseph are very English. So I've heard Yahweh used as the word for God in the Hebrew Bible, but I don't know. I mean, obviously Mary and Joseph are not in the Hebrew Bible that much, but at all. But what is that culture's version of those names? Like, what were those names as they were initially written?
Mary is Miriam in Hebrew.
Miriam. Okay.
And it's translated from Hebrew to Greek to Latin. I mean, you just sort of and it just becomes Mary, which is still Miriam in Hebrew. Joseph is a Hebrew name. I mean, it is what it is. And so we have those bits of translation. And I think, my Greek is really rusty, but I still turn to it, because I think there are so many nuances in Koine that we miss because we don't have adequate words. So, for instance, in today's text, the Matthew 2, we say the wise men were filled with joy. The text actually said they were joying tremendously. Right? We don't have a verb for joy, right? We don't have a verb for it. And so we have to sort of finagle the translation, to be filled with great joy, right? But that's not, so we kind of lose some of the context. But I think that's true whenever we translate language, right? And language is very specific, and it's specific to culture, and it's specific to a way of being in the world. And so we have to struggle with that, but we also have to trust that scripture is scripture because the Holy Spirit speaks through it, right? Otherwise, it's just dead words on a page. What our church has taught us is that when we open ourselves to it, that the living word speaks to us through it. And so that's what makes it scripture. And so while we can struggle with some of the translations, there is this piece that I believe that God does speak, right? God does speak. and figuring out how God is calling us in any given moment is important. But I'm just, this is a commercial, so you can like plug your ears, you know. But one of the things that I have been working with, and my husband's been working with and me on, is how do we redeem Paul from 2,000 years of patriarchy? because Paul is our first theologian, right? And it astonishes me that so many people have used Paul to proclaim the exact opposite of what Paul is proclaiming. Right? They have twisted him in crazy ways. And so we are doing a pilgrimage, we're sponsoring a diocesan pilgrimage in the footsteps of Paul, because I want folks to sort of walk the way Paul walked and encounter the culture Paul encountered, and then hear his words in a unique and different way. Because I have learned so much. And one of the things I've learned is that Paul had, whatever happened on the road to Damascus, he went and lived with Ananias for months and learned that it wasn't just about encountering God differently. It was about encountering the very world differently, about encountering every human being differently, in a more gracious and loving and open way. And so that's just my commercial. There you go.
Pilgrimage, when is it? Do you know?
It is October of this year.
The author of this question I happen to know.
You know a little
bit? Yep. And I think I know why the question is asked. What is our diocese doing to envision and support new ways to do church and new church plans?
So right now we're trying to figure out what the need is, what the spiritual need is in the world. And so we're restructuring how do we think about what campus ministry looks like. I believe people come to faith in transitional and liminal moments in their life, and college is one of those. But how we've done campus ministry is not the way we're going to be able to do it in the future. And so refiguring how do we do that. My goal, I would love to plant 3 new churches in the next 5 years, but I know that it is going to cost about $150,000 per church per year. And we don't have that in the budget right now. So figuring out that, and what I want to do about church plants, I mean, we have a wonderful, I'm calling her a missional entrepreneur in Lauren Grubaugh, who just sort of decided, oh, I'm going to try this thing. I think as it's working, it's great. But I will confess, I'm an Enneagram 5. I don't believe in building anything unless you have counted every cost and you have figured out what could go wrong and why. And so I am much more cautious and intentional, because one, I believe a worker deserves to be paid for their labor. Right? I believe that people, we should have a way to support financially folks who are doing a tough job of church planting. We haven't had a church plant since St. Bridget's. And St. Bridget's is going to become a parish this year. So figuring out what is the foundational support, how do we get that support, how do we make sure folks have it, and then what are kind of the things that we're looking for in terms of benchmarks. That's important. And so I'm in a conversation with the standing committee about how do we prepare to do that. Like what is it going to look like in terms of our diocesan funding? How do we do it? So yeah.
Who did plant it?
What?
Who planted St. Bridget's?
This one?
This is St. Paul's Senior Ward.
I'm like, you know that.
Little commercial. Along those lines, thinking about the transition points as being the entry points for the spiritual. One thing that I've noticed that the Episcopal Church can be good at is being that transition moment for people who were wounded by evangelical churches went away, but now it's like I need something. And
Or Roman Catholic churches. We're good at that. We're gonna bring them in.
So, but the question is, what can we do that kind of furthers that work? Because I think that's something that St. Paul's in particular is geared toward.
You know, one of the things that I have found is figuring out how you are present in your community outside the walls of your worship space. How do people see you in those places? And one of the things that I've noticed post-COVID is that congregations who are really clear about their why are rocking and rolling. I mean, I'll tell the story of a little church, St. Raphael's in Security, which is near Colorado Springs. Tiny congregation. They have a bivocational priest, and in the last year, they have grown. They have increased. They have the only food pantry in their part of the world. They are feeding 200 to 300 people a week. They are partnering with their community to do that, and that's kind of their why, right? This is why we're here, because the community needs us and this is amazing. And I think that's amazing. I mean, I think that's really good, and it's really about how can you be present? Where can you be present in ways that people get to hear your message? Right? Get to hear who you are, how you encounter God, what good that does for you. I just tell people, if your faith is not making your life better, just stop. I mean, it really, faith is about how do we find meaning and purpose and joy, even when the world around us doesn't have it, right? And how do we share that with other folks? I think, we need a lot more spreading of joy. Yes.
I was thinking about college campuses. And I was thinking about technology. Growing up today, it's all of this stuff and the lack of interaction with live people. And how do we, particularly on college campuses, how do we get people to interact with each other?
That's a tough piece. I was talking to my oldest child, who's 23, and he was saying, what he misses right now in his life is what he calls third space, which is space that's not work, that's not home, but is about community. And he said, for a long time, people thought that they could find that virtually, and it was a lot of fun, and then it quickly became apparent that it could be very toxic, right? And so that people were all over social media and yet feeling more and more alienated from folks. And I think that that's a thing that is prevalent in our world right now. And I think COVID only made it worse. And so figuring out that piece, my kids, I make them go on the diocesan youth events, my twins who are 17, and they weep and wail for the 3 days leading up to it because they have to give up their cell phone to do it. But they go and they come back 7 to 10 days later, and they have had an encounter, right? They've encountered people, they've encountered themselves, they've encountered creation. And I would say, even though they go, oh, Mom, they encountered the holy. And so there was a church in England, I think it's England, that the congregation, had dwindled down to next to nothing, and they were figuring out, what can we do? And they opened up their building for 5 hours a day, and it is no tech space. People come in, they do puzzles, they listen to music, they read books, paper books, but it's no text, and they fill up every day.
And one of the reasons I just read an article this last week about schools, elementary, high school, that they're saying you have to check your phone when you come in, and they put them in certain bags to isolate them. You can't use phone during the day in school. And that's a tremendous difference.
Yeah, my son is at Denver, they can't use their phones at school.
I want to go back to college campuses. Being our representative on the Front Range region, we have the majority in the Front Range region of colleges and universities. And Val and I have talked about, and maybe the diocese too, we have QC, who is a member of both the Synod, the Lutheran Synod, and the Episcopal Diocese. Could we have that kind of a person that focuses on college campuses too? Because we do a big amount with Lutheran Campus Ministry here. We support their whole program. So that would just be something to, again, as a future.
And we're working on that. I mean, again, was talking to Terry over in Greeley. I mean, she is working with the Lutheran Campus Ministry there. Same is true in Boulder. I mean, I think the future of church, we're gonna have to sort of wrestle with denominationalism in a lot of ways, because denominations are based on language and ethnicity and culture, right? That's what they're based on. And so figuring out how we break out of those ruts is going to be really important moving forward, because I think we need one another. We're definitely need one another.
Yeah. Pastor Paul wants to call it ecumenical.
Yeah.
Campus ministry.
But I think, figuring out how we keep a voice of loving Christianity present is important.
Is this a good time to take a minute and find out what our online folks, what, you guys have any questions, Charlotte or Joe?
I do have one, Lori. Thank you for asking. It has to do with church plants versus churches that are already in existence. And as I look at the St. Paul community as well as other communities, they're getting very white, very gray, and resources are limited. So how is our diocese addressing that piece? And also providing perhaps new and different ways of being church, as St. Paul's has done with our Zoom community.
Thanks for that. I think one of the things that I've come to learn is that our community, our congregational life is always context dependent. It's like, what is your context and how are you being called to meet that context? So for instance, and I said this at convention, if I have 3 little congregations in Mineral County where the average age is 59. Now, if the average age of the county is 59, I don't think it is helpful for a particular congregation to bemoan its lack of youth. Right? It's just not, it's not helpful. And so then the question is, how are you being called to minister in your particular community? And the other piece is that I always ask congregations is, what do you have to offer? I mean, whenever I hear, look, we just need people to come. It's like, well, what are you offering them? What are you offering them to better their life? Because, please come, I'm tired of being on Altar Guild, I need you to do my job. It's not to anybody. It's not, it just isn't. And so that's a piece I think that is really important for congregations. And again, it's about, what is your why? I was saying, I went to visit a church. I'm not going to call names. And this church, I was in worship. They had over 100 people in worship. They had kids. And all they did was whine. All they did was whine about, we're not as big as we used to be. And we used to have a huge youth program. I'm like, really? That's what you got for me today? But there just isn't enough money. And I loved what Bishop Kym said when she addressed our convention last year. She said, there's never enough money. There will never be enough money. And I always said, one of my spiritual directors said, if you think you have a money problem, you don't. It's another problem. And so for me, and I experienced this, I was in a congregation and we were going through some transition and it was rough and the money wasn't coming. And I had that conversation and my spiritual director said, you have a spiritual problem. And so what I talked to my vestry about is I said, this was in September, I said, I want us to decide that we're going to dedicate one of our Christmas offerings, all of that offering is going to go, we're going to give it away. And they were like, wait, what? I'm like, no, all of one Christmas offering, we have 3 services, pick the service, all of that offering is going to go, we're going to give it away. And then we're like, well, shouldn't we just have the services and then decide? I said, nope, we're going to do this in faith. We're going to decide what service it is. We're going to give that money away. We're going to start talking about it. There's a lot of grumbling, but they said, okay. So we picked an outreach service to homeless youth, especially queer youth. And we started advertising in September. One of our Christmas service, our 5 o'clock service, all of that money is going to go to this. And this is our gift. This is how we're going to honor Christ in our midst. We announced it all the way up. That Christmas Eve, we announced it at that service and just said, we ask you to give generously because all of this money that we're going to give away to support unhoused youth. We had the biggest Christmas offering that we ever had at that service. And when we came down to sort of do our budget at the annual meeting, we talked about it, and a couple that had come to that service came to the annual meeting. We talked about being 20 grand short of our pledge goal, and they wrote us a check for $20,000. Oh, wow. I don't believe in magic, but I do believe when people witness church acting like church, that they are moved, that the Spirit moves them. And so for me, that's I deeply believe that whenever congregations like we don't have any money, I'm like, you know what? St. George's Leadville has no money, but they still managed to feed almost 3,000 people because that's what their heart is. That's where their heart is. That's their why, right? And so, I think that when we become so concerned about maintaining ourselves, we lose sight of the mission and ministry that we're called to. And so my friend Jonathan Fultz in South Dakota always quotes William Sloane Coffins that Christian community is always called to risk something big for something great.
That's a good. My father's was, there's never lack of money, only lack of vision. That's the why.
The why, yeah, absolutely.
Charlotte, you were on for a minute. Did you have anything to add, or are you good?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
One final question that doesn't mean final questions here, but this was with the election of the new presiding bishop. It appears the national church is staged to be flexible and open to change going forward. The first question is, do you agree? And the second is, what is your perspective regarding how the Diocese of Colorado will respond to Bishop Rowe's leadership?
So, do I agree about the openness of the church? I don't know, but I do know that we do need to transform our structures to meet our reality. We are still living with a heritage of structures from 1911. And this is not that world anymore in any way, shape, or form. And so I believe that our presiding bishops have been called, at least in my experience as an ordained person, to their time. I believe Catherine Jeffert Shorey was called at a time where we needed her very steady, very straightforward leadership. I believe Michael Curry was called at a time where we needed to be reminded why it is we do this stuff, right? And I think Sean is called at a time because he is is strategic, and we need a new strategic vision of how we do church. He has a hard job ahead of him, so please pray for him always. And I think he is willing to do that hard work. He knows that it's necessary, and he knows it's going to be painful, and he's committed to doing it. So I'm grateful for that. With regards to the Episcopal Diocese in Colorado, I tell the House of Bishops all the time that Colorado is research and development for the rest of the Episcopal Church. Because we have to figure stuff out in ways that churches that, have, dioceses that have huge endowments and have, they're complaining about their 2-hour drive. I'm like, seriously? that we have to figure it out, right? We have to figure out how do we lift up lay ministry and lay leadership in real ways that make church happen in our smallest communities. How do we function in a diocese that is 2/3 funded by the gifts and tithes of congregations? Like we have to figure out how to make that work. And I think we're doing amazing things, and we're incubating things. So things like caffeinated church. We started that in our diocesan office to figure out how do we help support church administrators. How do we do that? We started caffeinated church. We have built up Project Resource, which is how do we talk about stewardship in a way that is more than about the 5 weeks we ask and ask and ask. How do we really talk theologically about how our faith forms us to be stewards of what we have? We built that, and we now have like 24 other dioceses buying into it. I had people calling me when the Fond du Lac, Eau Claire, and the Diocese of Milwaukee were becoming one diocese, and they're like, what's it like being a bishop of a large geographic region? Wisconsin is not large. Let's be serious about that. But dioceses are consolidating, right? Because the structure was too unwieldy. We just passed House of Bishops just passed an agreement to make the diocese in central Pennsylvania and the diocese of Bethlehem one diocese again. So we in this diocese have had to figure stuff out for a long time. And so they're learning from us. I'm pretty excited about that.
I have a question. It's kind of related to what you're talking about. It's not a deep theological question. I'm back to being Episcopalian after a brief 35-year hiatus. So I've Googled like the structure, and you don't really have to get into that unless you want to. But my question is more like, what does your job look like? What brought you here today? Are you on do you make rounds? Do you always come here on January 5th? No.
So the Episcopal Church in Colorado has 97 worshiping leaders. And as per canon, I have to visit every congregation at least once every 3 years. And so that usually gives me an average of 35 to 37 visits a year. And so that's part of it. My obligation is to be in every congregation. And I always say every congregation, not every building. It's different to me. Because a lot of we have a few congregations that are in partnership with other congregations. So that's part of that. And I always say my job is to make sure that we are focused on how do we build healthy congregations, because if you don't have healthy congregations, you don't have a diocese. So that's my intention and my goal is how do we help and support and encourage and empower congregations to be about the business that God calls them. So I do that. And in addition to that, I have regional confirmations. I have celebrations of new ministry, which we have had a lot of. We've had a lot of transition in clergy in the diocese in the last year and a half. So doing that as well.
Yes.
For 2025 and the next 4 years, seems like interesting times are ahead. You know, and, you know, in your words, violence is not the answer. Fully agree with that, but challenging and perhaps protesting, whatever. You know, I guess I'm curious, what do you view the diocese role will be? What do you encourage us to do? And on a side note, that's saying, you know, speaking up isn't always easy. You know, I feel vulnerable, you know, if I speak too loudly.
It is hard. I was remarking that every time I've spoken out against gun violence, I've gotten death threats. Every single time. And I'm still talking.
Good.
Because that's what I'm called to. I am encouraging folks, and I've done this with my own family, and they're kind of mad at me about it, but I've said, write down what it would take for you to think that this president has gone too far. Where is that line? Write it down. Write it down. So that I know, so that you know, that you said this is what it would take. And if you said nothing, then you've created an idol, and I will pray for you about that, right? I mean, because it is true. I have been in conversation with clergy, especially my clergy in the resort regions, who are really anxious about this rhetoric around violating church as sanctuary space. And you know, I'm like, we're having a conversation about that with Tech, the Episcopal Church, about kind of how we protect ourselves in our effort to protect others. And really the root of it is, if we have to always harken it back to our faith, right? It's our faith to give water to the thirsty. So there's a priest who was arrested in 2021 because he left water out. And when he went to court, he's like, this is my faith. This is what Jesus teaches me. This is what I promised to do. And they're like, oh, well, okay. Right? Because it is part of our constitutional right. Our freedom of religion is something that we hold on to. And I think it's something that we are going to have to fight for, because I am of the opinion that nobody gets to tell me how I pray. Nobody gets to dictate that for me. That is mine. That is part of you know, who I am as a Christian, to figure out how I pray. And it is part of what we as a collective have said is our right as citizens of this place. And I saw this wonderful, wonderful speech about it from a representative in Texas who was at the state legislature, and they were like, they wanted to demand that you put up a poster of the 10 Commandments. And I always go, why not the Beatitudes? Right? Putting up posters, why not the Beatitudes? But he was so eloquent and said so beautifully. He said, if a faith needs to legitimize itself by making people look at a poster, it's already dead. And I said, yes. Yes. And so I think we're gonna have to speak up. You know, our time for being quiet is gone. We're gonna have to stand up for people. And you know, I ask people all the time, so what's the line? Is it putting children in cages? Because clearly that was not enough. Is it, you know, declaring, you know, somehow you're above the Constitution? Is that like, what is the line for you? Put it, yes. I mean, putting people in camps, you know, what is the line?
I said bombing people in tents.
Well, that too.
That too.
Yes. Well, the fact that
so many people, particularly, have been calling the president, or, yeah, or whoever he is. In any case, and they are in such amount of, they're going to go, because he's going to say, you go to jail because you challenged. And that is something that just hits me up a storm of people who have done that and have tried very much to make it to make what we call our faith, to make us. They have done it too. They have done it. And it just kills me that they are going to be in a position that is off.
Well, I say to folks, the election results represent a third of this country, because fully a third did not vote. Yes. And I feel like as a person of faith, my job is those people that didn't vote. Because I don't know, do you guys remember the movie Full Metal Jacket? Yes. Oh, yeah. So there's a scene where the one guy who never should have been drafted, who was mentally ill, gets them in trouble again. Sergeant punishes them, and the platoon decides to take it out on this, and they're hitting him with soap. You know, just beating him with a sock with a bar of soap in it. And there's one guy, Joker, who was assigned to the guy whose name I can't remember, but he was trying to support him, trying to get him on board, and had sort of started becoming friends with him. The platoon was like, no, Joker, you have to do it, you have to, you have to, you have to. And Joker hits him once and steps away. And the look of betrayal on the guy's face is so profound. And then, as it happens, he kills the sergeant and takes his own life. I feel like our task as people of faith is to not only not be Joker, not to let ourselves cave when we know it's wrong, but our task is to reach those folks, to let them know there is an alternative, that you don't have to, and you're not alone in standing up to the bullies and the oppression and the injustice. You're not alone, because people do it with you. I really think we are kind of in the 1960s again. And we are going to be tested as to how much can we stomach when it comes to injustice and violence? How much can we stomach?
Well, that really touches me, because growing up in the 60s and the 70s, I didn't want to have to do that again.
Yeah.
And so it takes a lot in me to say, okay, I may be 70 something now, but I have to do it again, even as I did as a 20-year-old.
And what's the
Standing up, not being, mine happened to be in the church in regard to the ordination of women and allowing women to be at the altar. I was one of the first people to be at the altar in the congregation I was at. And I didn't want to do this again. And so it's sort of like, don't I get to coast? But no, I don't get to coast. That we have to do it again, even though it's really hard, and it's with the people we've walked our life with. I've spent the summer with the people I grew up with, having this conversation. And how do you keep having those things? But I am really fortified. Thank you for your words, because I've been saying, am I going the wrong way? I've alienated all these people because I've drawn a line in the sand and said, I won't do this anymore. But to hear you say, we have to not kill, this is a new mantra for me.
I think the reason that we can do what Sharon's talking about is that all the people in this room right now give us the experience and also the will to go and do what we need.
And it's like coming out when we were 50.
Yeah.
I thought I was skating, that I wouldn't be doing something like this again.
In Malcolm Gladwell's book, A Tipping Point, I think we can take a little encouragement when he talks about one of the tipping points is it takes that first person to walk out, and then everyone will follow. That we're all thinking somebody should help that woman in New York who's being beaten, and they're all standing looking, thinking somebody should help. And the first person that walked out brought everyone with them. So we can be encouraged with that human dynamic.
And I think, one of the lessons that I learned from my mom and my aunts who marched in the civil rights movement is that, when we stand together, there's power in that. There's power in that.
I think something to remember is, I wasn't alive during the 60s or the 70s, and we need, people to show us how to do this, because a lot of people my age didn't vote, and are mad and are angry and don't have community. They're just separate, yelling on their Instagram about all the injustices in the world, and then don't go vote. And we need people like you who did this already, because
Thank you.
We need each other. We do.
May I make a hospitality person? Take your own coffee cup and rinse it out because they stain real easily, and if you leave it in the kitchen, you don't have to wash it.
It's something we can do.
Action. We're about at time, so I want to thank you all for being present and thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.